Hello, students. Let's go over Chapter 9. All right, so let's talk about adolescence. Oh, well, that's unfortunate. It's trying to show little previews of. There we go. Now it is full screen how I would like to see it. All right, so let's talk about adolescence. That is Chapter 9. We'll talk about the physical and cognitive development. We'll get into some sexual identity development today as well. There's a lot of content to cover on adolescence, as we've talked before, through childhood and then up through adolescence. There's a lot of research on these topics. So, as we'll see later on in the chapter, adolescence is a time that's of concern to a lot of adults. So, adults like parents, grandparents, the generations that came before are very often concerned across cultures worldwide about adolescence and the problems that they might be having, sexual behaviors that they're doing, those kinds of things. So let's talk about some of that. So, one predominant view that you'll still see from a lot of lay people is that adolescence is a time of storm and stress. And researchers didn't help with this either. So, from about 1890 to 1920, there was a real predominant view that adolescence was a time of storm and stress for young people, that they were stressed out, that it was turbulent, that it was just full of problems, and adolescents were just problems to be managed, essentially. So 1950 to 1970, there was a lot more adolescent research that looked into more diverse ethnicities. As we've talked before, a lot of research early on in psychology was done with primarily young white men from middle class families, so quite a small sample if you're trying to learn anything about the general human population for a lot of topics. Adolescents were civilly engaged and protesting the Vietnam War at this time as well. So that started to be infused into research on adolescence. So in the 70s, researchers started to investigate young women rather than just boys and men exclusively. So that added a lot more dimensions to the study of adolescence. So what are some of the common stereotypes that you hear about adolescence? So just think about some, maybe write one or two down. So a lot of those stereotypes come from, well, general ideas as well as previous research. So of the idea that young people are problems that need to be managed. But more recently, well, here's one stereotype. Adolescents think they know it all. So you might have heard that said about adolescents is from parents or grandparents or teachers. Oh, that young person, they feel like they know it all. They think they know it all. And that one might be kind of true. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So it's an interesting effect of how much people think they know about something as compared to how much knowledge or wisdom they actually have on a topic. So here we have the dimension of knowing things. So how much do you actually know? Do you know a ton or do you know very little about a topic? And this dimension, the upward dimension here, this is your confidence, how much you think you know about a topic. So an interesting finding for many, many topics, many, many facts, learning about black holes, to learning about an illness, to learning about psychology in general. When you know a little bit about something, you start to feel like you know a lot, like you've learned so much about this, you know so many things. You might see this in someone after their first couple college courses. So they feel like they know a lot about these topics. And they do know a whole lot more than they did before, but they still, as compared to everything they could know about a topic, they still know very little. But they feel like they know a lot. And then down here, after you start to learn more, you realize, oh, there is so much I don't know, that now you feel like you know nothing. But you do know more than you did before. Then as you learn more and more and more, it starts to match up a little better with what you actually do know. So it's an interesting effect that people who know very little about something often feel like they know a lot about it. And then once they actually really start to get to know a topic really well, they realize they don't know very much about it at all. So you could think of over here people that are experts who've been working in a field their entire career. they know a topic really, really well. Here you can think of someone who's taken one course or read one book about it. They feel like they know a lot because they've gathered a lot more information than they had before, but they couldn't, say, solve problems in that field, things like that. So this is kind of how I felt when I was coming out of my first couple of years in undergrad. Maybe a little bit before I graduated. Then as I graduated and I applied to grad schools and I went through my first probably 2 years of grad school, I felt and I realized I was down here, that I knew like nothing compared to the vast array of things within a topic. And now that I've almost got that PhD finished, I feel like maybe I'm here. So that should give you a sense of this. So that idea, that stereotype that adolescents think they know it all, well, they do know a little bit, and so it's a natural human effect. They might feel like they do know it all. So more recent research has taken a more generally positive view of adolescence, and this is the perspective I come at it with. A lot of my research is with adolescents, trying to help them find things that are meaningful to them in their life, to find purpose in their life, and we'll talk about that in the next chapters in more detail. So positive youth development is an idea, or PYD I might refer to it as, is positive youth development. The idea that adolescents are competent or can gain competence in things. They can be confident about their own abilities. They can develop connections with people in their community, with their friends, with their family. They can develop those connections. They can have character, that they can have character strengths. We've talked about this in a previous, We've talked about that in a previous class. What is character? They can have caring. They can have empathy for other people. So we've talked about that a couple times throughout the course. Adolescents are fully capable of having empathy, both taking the perspective of someone as well as feeling the emotions of another person. So the positive youth development approach looks at young people as capable of doing a lot more than maybe society generally allows them to, in the US at least. So the new view, that PYD, that positive youth development perspective, is that adolescence is not a time of rebellion or pathology or crisis or deviance. In reality, adolescence is a time of evaluation, of commitment, of choosing, of finding places in the world. So adolescence is a time of a lot of growth and development and change that's positive in a lot of different ways. So adolescents have a lot of capacities, and we'll talk about those throughout this lecture today and the next chapter as well, of what adolescents are capable of. And it's generally a lot more than adults tend to give them credit for. So let's talk about the physical and cognitive development of the adolescent. So puberty. Puberty generally marks the beginning of adolescence. So that's basically where we draw that line. Like at that point, well, now you're an adolescent. So what is puberty? It's a brain/neuroendocrine process in early adolescence that provides stimulation for a lot of physical as well as some cognitive changes to the body. So it's a process, not a single event. It starts off pretty early on in adolescence, and then many things happen throughout the course of puberty. So it generally occurs or begins to occur between the age of about 9 and 16, and that onset is programmed into our genes. Like when that is going to start is programmed into our genes. There are some epigenetic factors to that as well. So people who have higher body fat content, for example, they tend to start puberty a little bit earlier than people who have very low body fat content. Those genes will be activated a little bit later in their lifespan. So here are some graphs of some of the main changes you might see, like visually be able to see on a person going through puberty. So for females, the average or generally the first things that you see are either breast growth or a growth spurt. So you can see here, this is the range where these things can occur, and the purple is the average for onset, and then green is completion onset. So generally for girls, one of the first things you might notice is either that growth spurt or breast growth. For males, testicular development or that growth spurt, or generally, and then penis growth as well, are all things that you might notice first. And you might notice here that the ages for females are generally starting puberty, and those visual things you might be able to notice earlier than for males. So with that, the timing of puberty is earlier than it has been in previous generations. So the onset's genetic, again, like we mentioned, but there are epigenetic factors. One of those is the body fat content, and there are probably a lot of other epigenetic factors that we're just starting to understand now. So if you see in the 1850s, the onset of puberty was closer to the age of 17 versus now it's closer to the age of 12. So there's a lot of different factors because of that. So high weight, BMI, obesity, those are all related to earlier onsets. Stress and conflict are also related to earlier onset puberty. So how might this earlier onset puberty affect the lives of girls going through puberty versus boys as they go through puberty? So let's think of a girl or a boy who is 12 or 13 and starting puberty. So, let's say probably they're the first one of their friends to start going through puberty, so they have physical changes happening to them. The other young people, they know, they have a sense of this is what's happening here. So what does the social situation look like for those early onset girls versus those early onset boys? Maybe pause for a minute and think about it, think how that might change if it was a girl versus a boy. So early maturing girls are more likely to do things like smoke and drink, have eating disorders, and have early dating and sexual experiences. They're more likely to have depression and view themselves more negatively. So generally, early maturing girls have a probability of a worse time in their development. It's a risk factor to other things. So we've talked about risk factors, we've talked about developmental cascades. Early maturing into puberty has the potential to lead to other negative outcomes. So versus early maturing boys generally view themselves more positively than their peers who are not maturing yet. They're more successful in their peer relations. They focus on their physical status rather than their academic and career development more. So that can be negative because if they're focusing on their physical abilities and their capacity, well, for a few years they might have that increased physical ability, but their other peers are going to catch up in those ways. So if they're not focusing on their academics or their career, they might be behind academically. Late maturation for boys actually has the worst outcome. So for girls, early maturing has the worst outcomes. For boys, late maturing has the worst outcome. So that might have been what you thought of a few minutes ago. If not, think about for a second, well, why is that? Why does there tend to be these negative outcomes for early maturing girls, and why does there tend to be negative outcomes for late maturing boys? So think about that for a minute. Maybe pause. So both girls and boys are preoccupied with their body image during puberty. So this is true across the board. Girls tend to be more dissatisfied with their bodies as puberty progresses, versus boys tend to be more satisfied as puberty progresses about the changes that are happening in their body. Over the course of adolescence, the body image becomes more positive overall for girls and boys. Just on average, that body image is higher. So health-enhancing behaviors such as exercise are also related to positive body image. So let's jump to brain development, which is a really big part of puberty.
Being a teenager is hard. That's the way of living with one, I'm told. One gets to escape this moody, angsty, confusing phase. And interestingly, such an extended adolescence is unique to humans. Other animals grow up a lot faster than we do. And you may think our teen years are just about streamlining bodies for baby making, but as it turns out, the storms of sex hormones that we associate with the teenage years are only a small part of what's really going on in the teenage body. Most of the action, it turns out, is happening in the brain. Until fairly recently, we thought that the brain finished the nuts and bolts of its development by the time we started kindergarten. But really, right as puberty rolls in, it undergoes massive remodeling. This amounts to several years of neural growing pains, as well as the other more visible growth that's going on all over your body. So take heart, whether you're going through it now, or about to go through it, or count yourself among the veterans of that turbulent decade. Know that the result of the teen years is a stronger, faster, more sophisticated brain. Someone had told me that 20 years ago. Let's start with that obvious scapegoat of adolescent anguish, hormones. That word itself is kind of a lazy shorthand that people use to describe the chemicals that some of our glands excrete that can affect our behavior. But the fact is, hormones have all kinds of jobs that have nothing to do with where you grow hair, or what turns you on, or whether you feel glum for no apparent reason. Hormones keep your heart beating and your body hydrated, and they make your organs grow and make you grow bone and muscle and skin. What people actually mean when they talk about teenage hormones are sex hormones. And yes, puberty involves a whole series of sex hormone storms, the first of which actually kicks in before you're out of primary school. That's when the adrenal glands start secreting androgens, which trigger the growth and activity of the skin's sebaceous glands, making skin more oily. Soon enough, more apocrine or sweat glands get activated, increasing body odor. Then comes the wave of hormonal agents that start activating the gonads. For boys, this influx of luteinizing hormones from the pituitary gland get testosterone brewing in the testes, and suddenly that guy has up to 50 times more testosterone than he did before puberty. This also changes the shape of the male body, promoting hair growth and building up lean muscle mass, just as the increased presence of estrogen in girls rearranges the deposition of their fat, stimulating the growth of breasts. Humans are actually lucky to experience the craziness of puberty only once. Many other animals undergo multiple similarly intense hormonal rodeos as they enter sexually active periods, sometimes called the rut or heat, every new breeding season. Some male species completely stop eating during their breeding period because they're just that sex crazed. And yet, all that said, teens are far less ruled than their hormones than you might think. There are other factors at play here. For example, your favorite moody teen may be by turns punchy, angry, depressed, or in a zombie-like fog because of their chronic lack of sleep. Sleep is vital to everyone, but it's especially important for kids and teens because it's during sleep that your pituitary gland releases an essential growth hormone necessary for development. A normal sleep cycle driven by circadian rhythm is regulated by the daytime release of cortisol, which helps you wake up, and melatonin, which helps you wind down when it gets dark. But this biology of sleep timing changes as we age, and as puberty begins, teens' sleep clocks get pushed back. Most adults start oozing melatonin around 10 p.m.-ish, but one study showed that teenagers don't start producing melatonin until closer to 1 a.m. This may be because puberty's hormonal frenzy is stalling the release of melatonin, and could partly explain why so many teens stay up late, energized by the night, but have a really hard time rolling out of bed with the alarm. Of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg deal, since watching reruns of The Simpsons and playing Call of Duty late into the night continues to stimulate the brain, which may further delay the release of melatonin. Still, some researchers are starting to advocate for pushing back high school start times in the morning in the hopes of having more focused students. So we got sex hormones changing the bodies and a lack of sleep.
So that's an important point that we'll come back to, talking about sleep. So these are other changes that you might not generally think of that are happening in the brain that are really driving a lot of puberty and driving a lot of different behaviors. And some of the behaviors you might see are maybe caused because of, say, the neurological effects of puberty, like not being able to sleep until 1 a.m. and then your natural body processes wanting to wake you up at 9. So if you're already in your second period by, say, 9 a.m., it makes sense why you might be really tired. I know I was in high school, so we'll talk about that in a minute, though.
To contend with, but increasing evidence suggests that there is something much bigger at work that's making teenagers so teenagery. Their brains. It turns out that brains actually take longer than we thought to fully mature. I don't mean physical size. Our brains are already about 95% full size by the time we're just 6, but more in the sense of the connections inside the brain. Adults, for the most part, know how to make decisions by evaluating choices and weighing consequences. They do this with their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for controlling impulses and emotions and forming judgments. Its neurons chat with the neurons in other regions of the brain responsible for, say, memory or movement through synapses. Thing is, teenage brains don't quite work like this yet. The prefrontal cortex may not be fully developed until your mid-20s, and teen synapses, those lines of communication, are still growing and specializing. They're also slow. As an adolescent brain keeps developing, its axons, the long tail-like parts of the neurons that transmit signals to other neurons, become more and more insulated by a fatty layer called the myelin sheath. This padding greatly increases the cell's transmission speed, and while it helps adults make faster decisions, it isn't fully formed in teens. These changes occur slowly, beginning at the back of the brain where the oldest and most fundamental brain parts reside, and slowly working its way forward to the more advanced and complicated brain bits. The prefrontal cortex is the last to be hooked up and shaped. So it's important to keep in mind that just because your favorite teenagers stayed up until sunrise binge watching The Walking Dead the night before an exam, it doesn't mean they're dumb or lazy. Their brains are just literally finishing being built. But at the same time, because all this brain building is just starting.
So this brings us again to positive youth development. So knowing that adolescent brains are still being built, it does let us know like what capacities, what things we can learn, what things we can do with those brains to help young people thrive for the rest of their lives. It's a really interesting time and place to be able to grow and develop a lot of capacities that you might not be able to do as well later on while this process is finalizing in your brain. So related to positive youth development, young people have this capacity to learn some things maybe a little quicker than an adult might not be able to. Adolescent would be able to learn those things, and it would be harder for an adult to. I think, hopefully you understood what I said.
To peak, this is also when the brain starts getting thinned out. You actually start losing connections that you don't use enough in a process called synaptic pruning, which has led to a theory that this is kind of a use it or lose it phase. Meaning, adolescence could be an especially important time to use your brain, play an instrument, engage in sports, write poetry, learn a language. Because by doing these things, you're helping hardwire those synapses and giving your brain topiary a lovely, lasting shape. Whereas if you're sitting around all day playing Candy Crush, those will be the connections that survive, which you don't need. This shaping of the teen brain manifests itself in other ways too, like in teenage attitudes. A group of scientists at the McLean Hospital in Massachusetts once hooked up a group of adults and a group of teens to MRI devices and then asked them to identify a series of expressions on photographs of adult faces. Interestingly, while adults correctly identified one expression as fear, the teenagers thought the faces showed anger, surprise, or shock. They weren't registering subtlety as well. Not only that, but the MRI images showed that adults and teens responded with different parts of their brains. Adults used the reasonable prefrontal cortex, while the teens mostly used the gut reaction emotional amygdala located farther back in the brain. Results like these might help explain why teenagers seem to experience frequent mood swings. For one, they tend to react quickly from the emotional part of their brain without running those reactions by the more rational frontal cortex, and two, it could be that they're just misreading expressions and therefore the intentions behind them. The frontal cortex also helps people relate to and understand each other, and you can imagine what happens when concern is misjudged as anger or worry as disappointment. The Fresh Prince has an entire song about it. But the truth is, as much as parents just don't understand, teens don't always understand either. When the emotional amygdala and the more rational cortex aren't fully hooked up yet, that can make it hard for teenagers to productively work through emotions. This kind of reactionary, impulsive behavior may also lead to more risk-taking. Adolescence is the time when we're most likely to experiment with whatever booze, drugs, or toad-licking is available, and unfortunately, it's also the time our developing brains are most vulnerable to lasting effects. Studies have shown that teens are more likely to become addicted to drugs and alcohol than adults, partly because their brains are more attuned to their reward centers. While the teenage prefrontal cortex is still developing, their nucleus accumbens, or pleasure and reward zone, forms early on. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when presented with a big potential reward, teen brains light up way more than kids' or adults' brains. But if the reward was small, teen brains hardly fired at all. So basically, give an adolescent a pat on the back, and you'll get a shrug. Give them a hot date or a winning goal, and their brains light up like Vegas. This, of course, does not always result in great judgment. A jacked-up, thrill-seeking impulse combined with an exquisite pang of peer pressure, plus a new driver's license, new sex parts, and access to substances can lead to some not good results. But still, this long and sometimes tedious remodeling process that our bodies go through in the teenage years isn't all bad. Many scientists have pointed out that our delayed adolescence lets our brains keep their flexibility longer, which, yeah, may make teens a little slow, but also more adaptable as they prepare for the adult world. In this way, you can see teen impulsiveness as boldness or independent thinking, and moodiness as a source of newfound empathy, and excitability as passion. Which means there's a lot of awesome energy floating around out there ready to decrease all kinds of world suck. Thanks for watching this SciShow Infusion, and thanks especially to all of our...
So lots of relevant points that we've hit at different times in the course that are very relevant to a lot of aspects of puberty and the development of young people. So some of the key points there that I want to make sure we're clear is that myelination of the brain, we've talked about this before, really starts from that back portion of the brain and goes up through to the prefrontal cortex last. That's finishing up in early adulthood, so 23, 24, 25 is when that myelination finishes up. So in adolescence, you've got those emotional cores of your brain, and those are finishing myelinating, so they're reacting really quickly. So they're functioning pretty much as they would for an adult. So adolescents are feeling more and stronger emotions than they ever have in their life. Like they talked about there, their reward center acts differently. Sometimes they misread communications. So that's very relevant for the next chapter as well. So a lot of these things that are happening in the brain drive a lot of human behavior. And with that, we can also use that time to help young people learn and grow and develop capacities that they might not be able to later. So I think we covered this well enough in the video. I won't talk about it in too much detail. Yeah, I just said that. So let's move on to adolescent sexuality. A lot of research has looked at adolescent sexuality. It's something that people across the world are concerned with, the older generations. So most research focuses on pregnancy, STIs, STDs. Adolescents are often negatively stereotyped in regards to their sexuality, that they're having too much sex, that they're having unsafe sex, things like that. So it's really interesting that all societies worldwide are really attentive to or concerned with adolescent sexuality. I find it especially funny because those who are concerned about it were adolescents themselves as well. So kind of funny. So adolescent sexuality is a normal part of human development, and obviously that's why we're covering it. So let's talk about developing a sexual identity. So it's more than just sexual feelings and attractions. A sexual identity includes things like testing out and developing your intimacy, how you want to be intimate, your sexual behavior regulation. So it's actually very similar in a lot of ways to identity development generally. So we'll talk more about identity development next time as well, and as we get into early adulthood. But generally, the same pathways and patterns that lead to any kind of identity for a young person also help lead them to a sexual identity. So physical factors like the body, puberty, hormones might have a young person starting looking around for sexual partners. Social factors like the peer social norms around them, that's going to have an impact. So these are multiple contexts. So those other realms, the dimensions, the context. I don't have a picture of the Lerner model or the Bronfenbrenner model, but hopefully you remember that, where there's a person in the middle. Sometimes it's seen as a child, and then there's their parents that are interacting with them, their school, the culture, things like that. So those are all impacting how a young person is thinking about their own sexual identity. So the culture, ideas about sexual orientation. So it is a difficult problem to study. So as two things that are really difficult to study with adolescents are sex and drugs. And there's a couple different reasons, but think about why might it be difficult to study adolescent sexuality. So just pause for a second, maybe write down a couple ideas. So why is it difficult? Well, there can be a lot of reasons. One is adolescents lie. It's actually really funny. I think the drug use for adolescents is a really funny example. Adolescents will tend to lie that they either use lots more drugs than they tend to use, or that they don't use any. So, trying to be cool to friends or to the researchers who are reading their reports, or trying to downplay what they're doing, because especially if it's illegal. So, as an example, when doing research on adolescent drug use, oftentimes you will put in extra terms. So you might have a list of, do you use this drug, this drug, this drug? Do you use THC? Do you use alcohol? Do you use LSD? You'll also include things that don't actually exist. So you'll make things up that sound like it could possibly be a drug. For all I know, this might be a drug. CKD or something like that. So you'd put that in there, and you'll find some adolescents will mark those things that aren't actually drugs, and they will say that they use them. They'll report on how often they use them, things like that. So lying is one reason it can be really hard to study adolescent sexuality. They often lie about their sexual behaviors as well. So what can you do to fix that? Well, a lot of different things that you can do. You can have surveys that are anonymous. You can try to make sure they feel comfortable. They're not doing a study with other people around them, so they don't have as much of that peer pressure. Make sure anything that they do, they know is completely confidential, so that it's not going to come back on them. Whatever they are doing, you're just wanting them to report. So that can be helpful, but it still is a problem to study this. So with that, the data we have hopefully is pretty reliable, hopefully is pretty valid, but there could be little problems with it because young people tend to lie. So the average age of sexual initiation is 16, and usually it's about 1 year between a first and second sexual behavior. So the timing of sexual behaviors, with that, adolescents now have been having less sex on average than previous generations. So if you look at adolescents from 91 versus 2011, you can see that 54% before had ever had sexual intercourse versus 47. So it seems like it's being delayed a little bit. So they're having a little less sex on average than previous generations. With that being said, oral sex rates have increased. So why might that be? Why might we see generally on average sexual behaviors have been decreasing, but for oral sex specifically, that has been increasing? So maybe pause for a second, write down a couple ideas you have, or just think about a couple ideas. So with it, oral sex is a little more common or popular among adolescents more recently because pregnancy, obviously with oral sex itself, pregnancy is impossible. But if it's leading to other things, then obviously that would be possible in that case. But pregnancy, if you're just using oral sex, is not going to happen, right? So that makes it a little more popular to use that. With that being said, for those who have a first experience with oral sex, they tend to also have penetrative sex within about 6 months after that on average. So STIs are still a risk with that, so it's not a completely safe option, obviously. So adolescents who only engage in oral sex increase or report an increased pleasure, they feel better about themselves, they have less conflict with parents. So with that, many adolescents tend to not see oral sex as a sexual behavior. And so with that, if a parent is asking them, hey, are you sexually active? And they're having oral sex, they might say no, and they feel like they're not lying. So that can reduce conflict. So funny contextual factors. With that, there are a lot of risk factors in adolescent sexuality, and a lot of research, like I mentioned, has focused on this. What kind of problems can occur with adolescent sexuality? So with that, I do want to reemphasize like that positive youth development perspective, that young people are capable of a lot more than we generally give them credit for. But with that being said, because of that brain development, many adolescents aren't necessarily emotionally prepared to handle sexual experiences, especially early sexual experiences. So the earlier the adolescent, the earlier that puberty development, their body might be developing faster than their brain is keeping up for emotional regulation, is one way to think about that. So with early sexual experience, there's also risks of early drug use as well, delinquencies, school problems, sexual assault, rape. There's also higher likelihood of not using a condom, and with that also having pregnancy. So being in low SES or inner cities also increases the risk factors for early sexual experiences. You might be able to imagine, if you thought back to why might adolescent girls who are early maturing, why might they have a worse time? Well, some of that reason is because their peers are often rejecting that early maturing girl. But who is maybe more accepting of that early maturing girl? Maybe peers that are a few years older, maybe people who might want to engage in sexual activities with that early maturing girl and lead to some of these problems. So not a great, there's a lot of risk factors there essentially. So with that, family context matters as well. If there's a lot of parent hostility, that's really highly correlated with early sexual activity as well, and having multiple partners really early on as well. When there's older siblings that are sexually active, that's related to early adolescent sexual experiences as well. Single parent homes, especially for girls, is another risk factor. So lots of risk factors here. So other ones, deviant peers in early adolescence. If a young person has low or weak self-regulation, they'll be more likely to engage in sexual activity early on. That's related to impulsiveness, and that's related to neural development. So the first sexual experience for any adolescent is often very impulsive. So like we talked about, that emotional center of the brain is fully formed more early on than the prefrontal cortex. So for a lot of adolescents, that first sexual experience can be really impulsive. They have these hormones, highly emotionally charged, maybe a first boyfriend or a girlfriend or something like that. And with that emotion, they're not regulating it maybe as well as they should. They're feeling all these feelings, and it just happens. So that tends to be pretty common for adolescents. And when that happens, when it is that impulsive, it's at higher risk of things like not using a condom. So with that, there are protective factors. So we talked about a lot of those risk factors. What are some protective factors? What can we do to help these adolescents to have good, healthy sexual experiences as they are developing and figuring this out? So parent warmth and support is very important. So we talked about parent monitoring a little bit last time. So parents who are supportive of their adolescents can be very helpful. Family connectedness, so having open lines of communication with family members, whether it's siblings as well as parents, that's very helpful as well. Parent-adolescent communication about sexuality specifically is really, really useful. So with that, parents and adolescents who are talking to each other about lots of different things and feel more comfortable talking about sexual behaviors, it's a very good protective factor. There was a friend of mine who, when their parents found out that they were making out with their partner, the next time that the parent came home from work, they brought home a box of condoms, and they sat down and they're like, hey, these could be useful to you, make sure you use them, help show them how to use them. And so they had a relationship where that was okay to do. It wasn't too weird for the adolescent or the parent. But if you're waiting to have just a single talk about birds and the bees, that could be pretty awkward. If you're talking with an adolescent a lot throughout their life, that can lead to those open communication lines, and that's a lot more effective at leading to, it's a protective factor against for healthy adolescent sexual experience. So parent monitoring, like we mentioned, positive school climate, so having the school be a positive environment, a healthy environment, a supportive environment just generally. A young person with high academic achievement, they tend to not have as risky of sexual behaviors. When you have higher self-regulation, a young person with high self-regulation tends to not have as risky of sexual behaviors. Internalized pro-social norms, so feeling like you should be pro-social generally is a protective factor. Adolescents with a sense of spirituality, that's also a protective factor for adolescent sexual experience. So that's overall in general. So let's also talk about sexual minority attitudes and behaviors. So, and the patterns that we see in the development in adolescence of sexual minorities. So usually attraction to the same sex or same-sex behavior or identifying as LGBTQ plus occurs in adolescence. With that being said, it can also happen in emerging adulthood or even later on than that. So it's very common in adolescence, but definitely later than that is pretty common as well. So one thing that they're testing out at this time might be sexual experiences in adolescence, different partners, different things that they might want to do. They're going to get into more relationships in emerging adulthood rather than just sexual experiences. So in adolescence, there's more testing out sexual experiences explicitly, versus in early adulthood, there's more testing out of actual relationships, girlfriends, boyfriends, those kinds of things. Later on in emerging adulthood is more common. One reason for that might be if you are, let's say, in a high school with, I don't know, my high school was about 600 people. So the percentage of the population that's LGBTQ plus is about 5%. So out of 600, I should have done this math. So let's say 5 to 7% of 600 people, that gives you that kind of smaller dating pool there, right? So let's say when you go to college or you're out in the working world, maybe now your possibilities for relationships are expanded. So that's one reason we see that testing out of early sexual experiences in adolescence, but more relationships as early adulthood rolls around. So I just mentioned this. The studies about people who are LGBTQ plus say that about 3% to 7% of the world population is LGBTQ plus. So it depends on the study. A lot of the more reliable studies that are using more people worldwide say close to about 5%, but some studies have even shown up to about 10% of the world population. So with that, research have investigated the development of sexual minorities, looking at genetics, looking at biology. So with that, biology specifically meaning hormones, brain chemistry, and the structure of the brain, as well as cognitive factors and environmental and social factors. So let's go through those one by one. So hormones, there might be a critical period to influence sexual orientation in about the 2nd to 5th month after conception. So that's still in utero, right? So that's still prenatal development. There might be a critical period to influence sexual orientation development at about that time. So with that, giving adult gay men male hormones makes no change to sexual orientation. There were multiple studies done like that in, say, 70s. So it did increase sexual desire to give more testosterone, but it didn't make any change in their sexual orientation. So genetics and twin studies are some of the main ways that we look at genetics. We've talked about this before a little bit with research methods. So with genetics, about 35% of the variation in men and about 19% of the variation in women can be attributed to genetics. So it's not entirely genetic, but it is a pretty large component, that 35% or 19%. So what does that mean? That means if you take two twin men and one is gay, about 35% of the time, the twin is also gay. So that's a lot higher probability than just the general population. So there's clearly some genetic components there. So there's also environmental and social factors. So many times attraction to other people starts in childhood. So that same-sex attraction can even start as early as childhood. With that, this is when sexual attraction starts generally for anybody. So the normative development of sexual orientation and attraction is starting there in childhood. And so those kinds of experiences, and in addition those genetics and those hormones in prenatal, so all those things combined make that likelihood of being LGBTQ plus just that much more likely. So this can also start in adolescence and be a lot more abrupt. It doesn't have to start in childhood. So some people might look back and say, oh, I remember even from the time I was a kid, I always liked this gender or something like that. Some people might not know that until adolescence or even early adulthood. So, early reinforcement and experience with the same versus opposite sex can also foster or hinder attractions in different ways. So, the main point here is there are a lot of factors that influence anybody's sexual orientation, whether they're LGBTQ plus or not, right? So, let's watch this little video about a really good way to view this sexual orientation. So you might have heard the term or someone argue that someone who is LGBTQ plus is born that way. Let's talk about a more scientifically accurate way to go about talking about it. This is one thing I like to get across to students in my psychology courses, because this is a very popular thing just out in the world to say, but as people who are learning about psychology, I want you to know that there are multiple factors that are influencing this. So let's talk about what those factors are so you have a better idea about sexual orientation and development from this academic point of view.
True or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights, you said true. Surveys have found that people who view sexual orientation as an innate trait, like eye color, tend to be more supportive of LGBT rights. Now, why is that? When asked, folks typically say, well, it's just wrong to discriminate against someone for how they're born. It's like ethnic discrimination. Makes sense. So for years, the Born That Way argument has been used to promote LGBT equality. Lady Gaga's song, Born That Way, even became an unofficial anthem of the gay community. But there are three problems with the Born That Way argument. First, it's not scientifically accurate. Second, it's not legally necessary. But third, and most important, it's actually unjust. And it's time to retire that argument for LGBT equality. Now, my passion for this issue stems from my own research on sexual orientation. Over 20 years ago, I started a study tracking over time 100 women with different sexual identities. And over the years, I was frankly surprised by some of the changes that they went through. Some of the lesbians ended up involved with men. Some of the heterosexual women ended up getting involved with women. And when these sorts of things would happen, women would say to me that they thought there must be something wrong with them, since their experiences didn't fit the conventional wisdom that sexual orientation is fixed at birth. So that brings us to the first problem with the Born That Way argument, that it's not scientifically accurate. Now, sexual orientation does often express itself very early and very consistently, but lots of times it doesn't. And it breaks my heart when I hear people express distrust of LGBT individuals who came out late in life, for example, after a heterosexual marriage. People will say things like, how could they not have known all this time? Are they sure that they're really gay? Just imagine how it feels to hear that from someone that you just came out to. But the plain truth is that gender and sexual development show a lot more variability than most people realize. And that variability often leads to change over time in sexual attractions. National and international studies conducted by researchers at Cornell, the Harvard School of Public Health, the University of Virginia, and many others have collectively tracked tens of thousands of individuals for 5, 10, 15 years. And guess what? sexual attractions show a fair amount of fluidity. Some individuals start out exclusively attracted to one gender, and over time they find themselves attracted to both genders, or vice versa. Some bisexual individuals shift from being more drawn to one gender to being more drawn to the other. Now, what does this fluidity tell us about the innateness of sexual orientation? Nothing. Nothing at all. Because they're completely unrelated. There is, to be sure, strong evidence for genetic contributions to sexual orientation, but those contributions do not cement your entire sexual lifespan from birth. What they do.
So this is exactly what we were talking about a minute ago with about that 35% of the variance can be attributed to genetic factors. Those genetic factors are not cementing someone into one sexual orientation for the rest of their life. Yeah, she makes a couple good points, and I'll probably repeat some of the things she says in a second.
Is push its development in a certain direction. If sexuality were totally locked down by genes, well then if you had two identical twins and one twin was gay, the other twin would be gay 100% of the time because they have the same genes. But in reality, twin studies have found that if you have two identical twins and one twin is gay, the other twin is gay 30 to 40% of the time. Now, that is way higher than you would expect by chance alone, so it is definite evidence that your genes influence your sexual orientation. But your genes do not provide the last word on every sexual feeling you're ever going to have. Now, before moving on, I want to make one thing crystal clear. The fact that sexuality can be fluid does not mean that therapists can cure individuals of same-sex attractions. That's sometimes called conversion therapy, and study after study has shown that it does not work, and it does immense psychological damage, increasing rates of depression, anxiety, suicide attempts. That's why conversion therapy has been discredited by all of these major medical and psychological associations, and it's why all of these former practitioners of conversion therapy have not only shut their own doors, but have publicly apologized to the LGBT community and have joined legal efforts to ban the use of conversion therapy with children and adolescents.
So I definitely encourage you to watch the rest of this video if you want to learn a little more about her research. She has other talks as well about specifically that study where she has followed those 100 individuals over the course of many, many years. And it's really, really interesting to hear the individual stories of some of those people. So, for example, one woman who was part of this study for, I forget if it was like 10 or 15 years, had always put that she was just completely heterosexual, completely straight. And then 1 month, there was just a blip where she said, well, this month I had an attraction to a woman. And then after that, she kept putting that she was completely straight. So it's like, well, why was it a little bit fluid? So she goes into the other questions that she asks and things that she learned. So those are some of the main things I want to get across here with this video. Is not that this born that way argument is, she goes on to say the born that way argument just should be retired and not used. What I want to get across is that point that it's not a scientifically accurate way to think about it, that there are many factors influencing this fluid sexual orientation and identity that people have. So it's just the genetics, the way you're born is just a couple of the factors. There's many other factors. So there are people who like she mentioned, completely change their sexual orientation later on. But with that being said, I'll reiterate, that doesn't mean that we should try to change people's sexual orientation, try to force them one way or another. That would be inappropriate and unethical. So yeah, don't do that. But hopefully you have a better idea of the development of these sexual orientations, because a lot of these same factors, genetic, socio-cultural, a lot of these factors are affecting anybody's sexual attitudes. All right, let's talk about adolescent pregnancy rates in the US compared to other developed countries. So it's interesting that we see about 6 times more adolescent pregnancies here in the US than in countries like the Netherlands. But interestingly, there doesn't seem to be any more sexual activity of adolescents in the US than those in the Netherlands. So why might that be? Why might we have about 6 times more adolescent pregnancies in the US than a country like the Netherlands, where adolescents are about the same level of sexual activity? So with that recently, so since about 2010, there has been a lowering of the teen pregnancy rate, which is a good sign. So here we've got a little graph of that. So still not great compared to other countries though. So why do we have this high rate? Well, childbearing is seen as an adult activity in a lot of countries rather than a adolescent activity. There are a lot clearer messages about sexual behavior in these other countries and access to family planning services that we don't have here in the US. So there's higher risk for preterm and low birth weights for children born from adolescent pregnancies, higher risk for the mothers having depression, higher risk for school dropout for those mothers, and this is combined with other risk factors like low SES adolescent parents. So all those risk factors can combine as well. So like we've talked about with developmental cascades before. So let's talk about one thing that is basically the most effective at reducing adolescent pregnancy, and that is comprehensive sex education and family planning. So let's watch a couple videos about what comprehensive sex education is and then how it's actually used in schools from kindergarten up. So that might make you surprised to hear that comprehensive sex education is used all the way from kindergarten on up, but it'll give you a good sense of what are we actually talking about with kindergartners. And you'll see that it's really things like, well, how do you respect other people? That kind of thing, which later on, developing those socio-emotional relational skills will lead to better, more appropriate, more healthy relationships in adolescence and adulthood. So let's learn about comprehensive sex education.
In today's changing world, growing up isn't always easy. Imagine being without accurate information and reliable skills as you navigate the journey to adulthood. Do myths end up masquerading as reality? Do peers, television and the internet stand in for reliable resources and information from caring qualified adults? Fortunately, comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, can make this journey easier, more certain and healthier for many young people around the world. You may know CSE as life skills education, family life education, or HIV prevention education. No matter what the name, CSE aims to ensure that all young people develop the knowledge and skills to make conscious, healthy and responsible choices about relationships and sexuality. CSE has always been a part of many cultures. Often family members taught young people about puberty, sex and relationships. Now, as societies change, the responsibility is increasingly shared with health workers, teachers and schools. CSE in schools is led by trained teachers and professionals. It focuses on the development of practical skills and knowledge that is scientifically accurate and comprehensive. CSE starts in primary school with age-appropriate content and builds on topics gradually as the child grows older and develops. It looks at human development throughout every phase of life, including physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions. CSE gives young people a chance to think critically about gender and about their role in their culture and society. It teaches about tolerance, non-violence, respect, equality, and empathy. CSE shapes values, attitudes, and decisions about relationships, including healthy sexual relationships when the time comes. With this knowledge and these life skills, it's easier for young people to decide if, when, and with whom to have sex, and how to say no if that's not what they want. It's a fact. All the evidence shows that good quality CSE helps young people to delay their first sexual experience. It also helps prevent HIV, sexually transmitted infections, and unintended pregnancy. Young people deserve to be healthy, happy, and to realize their fullest potential. They deserve to grow up in a world with CSE, a much less scary, less confusing, and less harmful place than a world without it. As leaders, teachers, and parents, we have the responsibility to act now. So comprehensive sexuality education is part of every young person's journey to adulthood, no matter where in the world they live.
So hopefully it's a little clearer to you now that comprehensive sex education is more than just talking about how to have sex safely. It's a lot more about relationships and how to engage in relationships with other people in a healthy manner. And so that kind of discussion of how do we share, how do we treat people with respect, that can start early on in kindergarten, preschool, that time. And then those skills, those relationship skills, are really relevant even later on in adolescence, and can then be applied to things like sexual relationships with a partner. So that's what we're talking about when we're saying comprehensive sex education. It's comprehensive, similar to how the psych class, we get a comprehensive view of human development. So we look at human development from the physical development aspects, the cognitive, and the socio-emotional. Comprehensive sex education targets each demographic of age and lets them know a lot of things that are relevant at that age that will then later on kind of culminate and be relevant for learning how to navigate relationships well, to make wise and informed decisions about sexual behaviors. So let's watch some examples of how comprehensive sex education is actually implemented at different ages.
Anna?
The wounds are perfectly good, but not.
Well, I know, and then you just... What do you think we're going to talk about today?
Sexual intercourse.
All right, get it out now. All your giggles, whatever you need to.
Healthy sexuality education encompasses all the different components, aspects of one's sexuality. So parents are doing the primary work by communicating their values.
Could you tell me about sex?
About sex.
And then teachers and other professionals are providing young people with the information they need and the opportunity and spaces they need to discuss those things with their peers. Sex education in kindergarten should focus on empathy and narrating emotional experiences.
Fidel, when are you glad? What makes you glad?
Doing cartwheels?
Doing cartwheels makes you glad.
Sex education in elementary school should be an extension of that and focus on how we treat each other and that it matters.
We're going to get explicit really quickly. We're going to talk about anatomy. You ready for that? Okay.
Sex education in middle school should include puberty education that is medically accurate and comes from credible resources, as well as how that information can be applied to the social dynamics that they're experiencing. Sex education in high school should include additional information about safe sexuality practices and also continued practice on how to apply that information to the complexities of social dynamics. So students have the opportunity in a school setting to talk about these issues, learn about them with the very people who they may be exploring those things with. And that's something that you can't really create in your home.
So hopefully you can see how this comprehensive sex education is really similar in a lot of ways to other programs that we've talked about that are working on developing people's socio-emotional development. So it's building skills throughout the lifespan that are then relevant to sexual behaviors. And like it said in the first video, comprehensive sex education has been shown to be the most effective method at reducing unwanted pregnancies, for making sure that STIs are low, reduce transmission of HIV, lots of good things. So there's another video linked here if you want to know a little bit more, comparing comprehensive sex education versus abstinence-focused sex education. Because you might see that one thing that wasn't talked about there was abstinence. So the idea there is that young people can make that choice themselves, to give them the skills and the opportunities and the skills that they need to be able to make that decision on their own. So with that, giving access to contraceptive methods, a life options approach, giving a lot of community involvement and support for these programs is really important to them working well. So these programs are not just a one-time thing in middle school, so a one-day or even a one-week class. It's something that's building throughout school time from early on, even in kindergarten, a focus of schools in general as well as communities. So this is some news articles from early in 2019 in Utah. So it's about some of the changes that were recently made to sex education in Utah. Up until 2019, abstinence-only sex education was the only type of sex education that was permitted to be done, period, in Utah. So now, if you want to read these little snippets of these articles, you can. I've got a link to the full articles there. Now, it is allowed or permitted to do some discussions about other things like sexually transmitted infections, ways to avoid pregnancy, contraceptives. So it's a little bit of a change, but it is not comprehensive sex education. So while it's better than it was in 2017, it is not what it should be now at this point in time. So there's a lot more to be done to bring Utah up to date with comprehensive sex education. If that existed, we would see a lot fewer teen pregnancies, a lot fewer instances of STI transmission. It would generally be better. So, and I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what comprehensive sex education is. So hopefully you have a lot clearer idea now, so then you can share that, maybe share these videos that were in these lectures with people who might not understand what comprehensive sex education is. Alright, so this is another topic we touched on in an earlier video for this lecture, and that is sleep. Adolescents are generally not getting enough sleep, and neither am I. But that is probably true for all of us here. So lower sleep than needed is related to things like depression, poor cognitive performance, messing up my spelling, you know, those kinds of things. More delinquency for adolescents. In all seriousness, it just leads to having a harder time understanding school material, and also can lead to harder times with socio-emotional interactions with relationships. So adolescents will sleep around 9 hours and 25 minutes on average. So let's say an adolescent had a Fitbit, that should be what about the average of what their sleep is showing them. So older adolescents secrete melatonin later in the day than adults. So the later on in adolescence, so 17, 18, 19-year-olds will be secreting melatonin a lot later, not going to sleep naturally until about 1 a.m. So schools really should be starting later than they are. So When I'm in an in-person class, I ask students to raise their hand if they think they had the earliest start times for school. I believe the earliest I ever heard was 7:15 for the actual school starting, like for the first class actually beginning. And that is just really awful for adolescent health. They're not getting enough sleep. If their body naturally wants to get to bed at 1 a.m., they really need to be starting school quite a bit later. Some schools have moved to 8:30 or even 9 a.m. for starting school, and that is a lot better than, say, 7:15. So with that, some other things that are really important for adolescent health, and we've touched on this pretty much every single age group. So exercise. So only about 48% of adolescents meet the minimum recommendations of 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So with that, good exercise habits can lead to things like lower blood pressure, lower incidence of type 2 diabetes, improved sleep, which we just talked about, and that video about how important that sleep is, lower depression rates, also better psychological well-being as well. So another health factor that we'll talk about today, we'll go through this pretty quickly because I don't want today's lecture to be too long. Let's talk about eating disorders really quickly. So of these eating disorders, essentially all of them are more common in girls than boys. So anorexia nervosa is a relentless pursuit of that thinness through starvation. So not eating very much at all, being very controlled in a diet, restricting that energy intake. It's often related to also an intense fear of gaining weight, or even a disturbance in how you experience the shape of your body or your weight. So a distorted view of seeing yourself that way. It typically starts in about mid-adolescence, and it usually starts after a period of dieting as well as stress. So let's say an adolescent starts dieting, then they have some finals coming up in their courses. That would be a kind of recipe, a couple risk factors to leading to developing anorexia nervosa. So teens often set really high standards for themselves, and especially if they can't meet them, they will often turn to something that they can control, like their weight. So they can really manage that. It's a lot easier than, say, their high standards for maybe some academic pursuits. So that can be easier to say, well, I'm only going to eat X number of calories a day versus trying to do a lot better in math, maybe a lot more difficult. So controlling this might be easier. So genes play a role in this. Family context also plays a role. The physical effects of dieting may change neurology actually to make this distorted pattern the norm. So like we've talked about developing habits and how the neurons work, it can actually, that dieting as well as that stress at the same time can actually lead to this kind of disorder. So bulimia is a little different. That the kind of pattern here is binge eating and then purging. So usually through vomiting or laxatives, so eating a lot very quickly and having very little control of what you're eating during that episode. And to be diagnosed as bulimia, it needs to be at least 2 times a week for about 3 months. So there's often with bulimia a preoccupation with food and a fear of becoming overweight, higher rates of depression or anxiety, as well as a distorted body image. People with bulimia often fall within the normal weight range because they are getting some calorie intake, they're getting some fats, proteins, those kinds of things, so it can make it a lot harder to detect bulimia than anorexia. So often people who suffer from bulimia are somewhat overweight before they develop the disorder, and then that binge eating often happens during that dieting. So they'll start with a diet, then they'll start binge eating. And cognitive behavioral therapy can help a lot with bulimia as well as for anorexia. So let's move on to cognition. I know that's kind of a sudden jump, but that's how the chapters put it together: physical development, including health things, as well as cognition. So Piaget thought adolescence at this time was adolescents were in the formal operational stage. So with that, thinking that adolescents have the ability to have more abstract thoughts rather than these concrete thoughts that we talked about in middle to late childhood. So now adolescents have the ability to do metacognition, think about thinking. This leads to idealistic thinking as well, and contributes to thinking about who they want to be. So you can see how this can be related to identity as well. So able to think systematically, test different solutions, use hypothetical deductive reasoning. These were all abilities that Piaget observed and thought adolescents had. So with that, there is a lot more individual variation than Piaget thought with these different skills. So some adolescents will gain some of these abilities even in childhood. Some of them, any individual might not gain some of these abilities until later on in adolescence. So culture and education have a lot bigger effect in adolescence in these cognitive capacities than Piaget thought. He thought they were really quite standard stair steps of development. But if you're teaching a young person to use hypothetical deductive reasoning, they're going to be able to gain that capacity. It's something that can be learned earlier than Piaget thought, for example. So even children can be taught to reason at a higher stage than Piaget would have thought possible. So it's good that we have these observations from Piaget. It was a good start for a lot of developmental psychology, which is why we still touch on him even in these chapters. But we'll move on from that. So one thing that I want to emphasize here that's really related to a lot of things adolescents think and do in their social interaction is adolescent egocentrism. So this will come into play a lot for socio-emotional content in chapter 10. But what this is that heightened self-conscious that adolescents have. So here's a little comic. This adolescent is wondering, are they looking at me? Is there something on my face? And interestingly, those adolescents that seem to be looking at this adolescent are probably thinking the same thing as well. They have that heightened self-conscious. There's two key components here, an imaginary audience and a personal fable. So what that means is that imaginary audience is a belief that other people are as interested in them as they are. So thinking that other people are looking at them, that people are watching them, that people are an audience to what they are doing. And that personal fable is a sense of uniqueness or invincibility even. So with that, they may believe, and this is very common for adolescents, believing that no one can understand them and how they feel because of their uniqueness and invincibility. So those things together lead to this sense of adolescent egocentrism. It's a normal time in development. A lot of this is because of neurology. These kinds of risk-taking behaviors, thinking that they won't get hurt. A lot of that is because of this. So think about, and depending on what structure this class is that you're watching this lecture for, you might have a discussion board or a group activity talking about different problems that adolescents might have, such as a breakup, anxiety, popularity, depression, risk-taking behaviors, and how those are related to adolescent egocentrism. So let's move on to executive function. So this is related to that prefrontal cortex that we talked about, its physical development. It's not finished its myelination, so some adolescents will have a little more prefrontal cortex, a little more executive function than others, just based on their individual differences in development. So with that, some of the most important changes in adolescent cognition come from executive function. So these higher level cognitive processes. So managing thought, goal setting, self-control, these are all things that fall under that banner of executive function. So cognitive control, that's things like controlling attention, being cognitively flexible, being able to move different ways, to solve problems, to be focused on something else, then move to focus on something else. Reducing interfering thoughts, so if there's distracting things happening, being able to focus through those. And this is really dependent on that brain maturation and the pathway specialization, the habits, the things that an adolescent has learned. So a lot of cognitive control can be learned, can be developed.
So decision making, that's the ability to just make decisions, make those choices. So regulating emotions helps a lot with this. So an adolescent who is better at regulating their emotions, who has that kind of executive function, will do a better job at this. As we know, adolescents have those emotions that they're feeling stronger and more intensely than before in their lives. So older adolescents generally do make better decisions than younger adolescents, and part of that is because of that emotion regulation. So sensation seeking is also correlated to poor decision making. Peers being around increase the probability of risky decision making. So if you take an adolescent with 2 peers versus 4 peers versus 10 peers, the more peers are around, that increases the probability of risky decisions. So what real world decisions are adolescents facing at this time in their lives? So think about that. Think about the context adolescents are in school, or maybe working, or just with their friends in their social context. What kind of decisions might they be making, and how might this executive function impact those? So maybe even pause and write a couple notes down. Another aspect of executive function is critical thinking. And so what we mean by that is examining the facts and judging if evidence supports those things. So thinking critically about any kind of topic or fact that they might come across. So with that, they need to be reflective about things that they've learned before, productive, like asking questions or coming up with new knowledge around that topic. So adolescent critical thinking is still very self-serving. So part of that's that egocentrism there. So with that, when we look over studies of 11th graders, about 43% of them will demonstrate critical thinking. So this again is a skill that can be learned and taught, but just on average, that's about how often we see it. So processing speed, so that's really related to that myelination that's happening in the brain. That is very important for critical thinking. It leads to increased knowledge, better planning, better goal setting, and all those kinds of things. So we've got a lot of information, and we'll move on to a different aspect of the context in adolescence, and that's the school. We've touched on this a couple times with a lot of these topics, but let's talk about that transition from middle to high school in adolescence. Many things are happening in this time. So when an adolescent is moving from middle school to high school. So puberty is probably happening. There might be changes in the family, changes with their peers. Maybe some of their peers are going to one school and not the same one. There might also be changes in the parents' context. One school might have been really warm and supportive in the middle school, and then maybe moving to their high school, it's not as warm and supportive or as safe an environment, or maybe vice versa. They're in a middle school that's not as safe an environment, then their high school is a more safe environment. So all these kinds of changes can add up and with that. So peers in middle school tend to be more different, not as homogeneous as they were in elementary school. Social hierarchies change. So when you go from middle school, you're kind of the oldest group there, and then now you're in high school, you're the youngest group. So your social hierarchy has changed there. You might feel more grown up and independent with that move from middle to high school. So how can schools be more effective? Well, that high school transition can be really difficult. So many schools, especially in low income areas and those with lower testing scores, can have a especially hard time and can be especially difficult context to navigate for these young people. So comprehensive and individualized teaching helps a lot. So the smaller the class sizes, it seems, the more comprehensive the teaching can be, the more individualized the teaching can be. That helps a whole lot. Again, that is related to teacher training, funding for schools, the number of faculty available, those kinds of things. So teacher training can be improved as well. So we do expect a whole lot from schools. So we talked earlier about comprehensive sex education, how many years ago it was just thought of as something that parents, family, that maybe the community did, and now we have health professionals as well as schools
that are taking so much of this responsibility. So we are putting a lot of responsibility on schools. So the community context can help with things. The community can help with food for the schools, tutoring, providing extracurricular activities. Schools themselves don't have to be providing things like extracurricular activities. Communities can provide vocational training, health services for young people. So kind of the point here is a school context, even though a lot of what we do here in the US has put much of the focus on the school being the primary provider of a lot of these for young people. We need to remember it can take a village to raise an adolescent. So having a community, having families, having people together trying to build up in a positive way these adolescents is going to be a lot more effective than just relying on that school exclusively. So one example of this is service learning. This is when adolescents engage in activities outside the classroom, generally in the surrounding community, to try and do service for that community. So a lot of the goals here is for adolescents to become less self-centered and more strongly motivated to help others, see how the community works. Sometimes it's related also to like internships and job programs, to give adolescents a sense of what's actually happening in their community, where they might fit with their skills or talents or abilities. So they might be getting tutored, they might be doing tutoring for younger people. They might be helping older adults, working in a hospital, helping at a child center. One school that I've worked with closely doing research has a lot of young people who go and help with different veterinary clinics around, and a lot of students like to do that. So I've got a really good example of service learning in a university actually in Hong Kong. So it's a little later in adolescence than we're generally talking about here, but it's got some really good examples.
What are the key objectives of university education? To prepare our students for success in their chosen professions, to nurture them into all-round global citizens. Knowledge and skills are important, but what is more important is whether they have a serving heart and a strong sense of social responsibility. Students are our future leaders. We count on them for a better tomorrow. This is why PolyU has launched a compulsory credit-bearing service learning program in 2012 when we reformed our undergraduate curriculum. We connect professional education with the society, providing our students with opportunities to better appreciate various issues and challenges from a wider perspective. The service learning program is always a fulfilling experience, opening up the mind and heart of our students while bringing positive changes to the world. Let's see how they are doing.
佢哋呢度啲人咧係特別會開心啲嘅，你會見到佢哋會上堂嘅時候同你係一種亦師亦友嘅關係。可能呢度嘅資源比較匱乏咗啲，我哋希望藉住呢個課程，我哋就去幫多啲佢哋，同埋去了解多呢個世界嘅另外一面。因為
So hopefully with that you see some examples of service learning. Again, some of that is for job placement, some of that is to give young people a better sense of social responsibility. And a lot of high schools in the US are doing a lot of service learning. Some it's compulsory, like it was at this university in Hong Kong, and for some it's voluntary. So one of the schools that I've worked with doing research, the young people can choose to do it as, say, a senior project or through their years of high school. So service learning can be really effective at helping young people gain a lot of skills and use the skills that they've gained in different ways. So one thing that I want to reiterate now at the end of this lecture
And hopefully you could hear any of the things that I was saying in the last minute since I left my microphone over there. One of the things I definitely want to reiterate is this idea of positive youth development. So service learning, comprehensive sex education, communities working with schools, all the goal here is to give adolescents a positive and healthy way to develop. Give them the support they need, let them make choices for things that they want to do on their own. We'll talk about this in socio-emotional as well in the next chapter. But adolescents are capable of a lot more than we generally give them credit for. So there's definitely limitations that they have with their cognitive and neurological capacities, but even with those, they have a lot greater capacities than people generally think. So we can help young people develop in positive and healthy ways and help support them and scaffold them in making these choices for their lives. So that is chapter 9. Next time we'll go on to chapter 10.